Hello, Pirates. Today we are just taking some quick notes on the introduction to genetics in terms that are going to be basic terminology used in our genetics unit. So the first column you have here is a list of specific people in the case of Gregory Mendel or different terms that we'll be using. And you have a column with the definition, a column with examples. So this is your example column right here. And then at the last column, we're just going to put a graphic. So just kind of going over these terms to make sure that you guys understand what they are and what they mean. So, and their importance. So when we're looking at our introduction to genetics, like I said, it's really important that you understand the basic vocabulary and also understand who Gregor Mendel was. So Gregor Mendel is considered to be the father of genetics. He was an Austrian monk. And he was an Austrian monk who was very interested in inheritance patterns, and he did his study in pea plants, so like garden peas. And he did a lot of genetic research. He grew plants, and he made meticulous observations about the pea plants and their traits and characteristics. So the flowers, the height of the plants, the shape of the peas, the color of the peas. And over time, with these thousands and thousands of observations, he started to notice inheritance patterns. So he applied math, counting, the offspring and counting the traits in the parents to genetics. And this really became the first scientific study of genetics that's recorded. So Gregor Mendel, he's considered the father of genetics because he applied math. Okay, he applied math and science, scientific processes to studying genetics. And like I said, he studied garden peas, and one of the traits he studied was the shape of the garden peas. So were the garden peas round and green? So garden peas, there's a garden pea, and he studied, could they be green or could they be yellow garden peas, or could they be round in shape, or could they be wrinkled? So that's your little graphic for that. Remember, he's the guy with the garden peas. All right, when we talk about genetics in general, generally the term genetics, we're talking about your genes, and this is the study of your heredity and how you inherited your traits, okay? And we're just going to cross out the examples in the graphic for these because they're just kind of straightforward definitions for the next two. Your heredity is how specific traits are passed from the parents to the offspring. So you guys can kind of think about your family and think about some of the genetic traits that you have and how you inherited and how those traits were passed down. So, for example, oh my goodness, I've got like a little allergy sneeze. For example, in my family, the color of my eyes or the color of my hair, or do I have freckles, or the shape of my eyes, all these are inherited traits. So these are traits that are passed down from my parents to me. So for example, my mom has freckles and my dad has freckles, and no surprise, I also inherited freckles. So this is what genetics is. We're studying these inherited traits and how they're passed from parents to offspring. What a trait is a specific characteristic. So when we're talking about your traits, we're talking about specific genes or traits that you have inherited. So for example, for Gregor Mendel, this would have been things like the color of the flowers, on the pea plants. Were they purple or were they white? So things like flower color, or like I said, your eye color. That is an inherited characteristic. The color of your hair. The color of, do you have freckles or not? All of these things are inherited traits, okay? So these are all inherited traits and characteristics. I'm just going to leave that blank there. An allele, when we talk about alleles, this is another word we're going to be using. The allele are the different forms of the trait that can exist. So what are the different characteristics that exist in the population? So flower color in pea plants, the pea plant flowers, they could be purple or they could be white. Those were the two alternative forms of the trait. Pea plants don't make any other flower colors. They're either purple or white in the pea plants that Gregor Mendel was studying. So these are the alternate or different forms of the traits. So like I said, it could be something like purple or white flowers. And I'm going to say flower petals, so the petals could be purple or white. Or in my case, maybe it's freckles. Do I have freckles? One variation, I can inherit the trait to have freckles, or I can inherit the trait for no freckles. And you guys are going to see in simple dominant recessive genetics, we're going to see a lot of that. You're either having the trait or not. For the purple or white flower petals, you either have the pigment for purple flowers or you do not, okay? Or another allele could be like different eye colors. So we could also say like different eye colors. And just for a graphic here, I'm just going to do eye color just to kind of show like what those different eye colors could be. Or we could do like what are the different alleles in the population? What are the traits? So we'll do with pea plants. I'm going to say like, here's my pea plant flowers. These are the stems. And then with those pea plant flowers, like I said, they could either have white flowers, so little white flowers, or those little flowers, they could be little purple flowers. Okay, so white flowers or purple flowers. Or if we were looking at eye color, blue eyes, brown eyes, green eyes, these are all different alleles in the population. I'm going to use the example of freckles to explain genotype. And this is the genetic combination that you've inherited. So the alleles are the different traits in the population. The genetic or genotype is your genetic makeup of the trait. So what genes were actually inherited, and this is shown as a letter combination. And we're going to use capital and lowercase letters to represent dominant and recessive traits in simple dominant recessive genetics. So for example, if I'm looking at freckles here, you inherit, if you guys remember how you inherited a chromosome from each of your parents, your homologous chromosomes. On those homologous chromosomes are the traits for things like freckles. So you inherited a trait from freckles from your mom, and you inherited a trait from your dad. So these letters are representing what is the variation or the allele you inherited from dad, and what is the allele or variation you inherited from mom. So I'm just going to say, imagine that someone inherited freckles from their dad to have freckles, and that they inherited the trait for no freckles from their mom. So freckles is actually a dominant trait. So we use a capital letter to represent that. So big F would be inherited a trait for dominant to have freckles, and a lowercase f would be that you inherited the trait to not have freckles. And like I said, you inherit one of these traits from each of your parents. So you inherit one from mom and one from dad. So we're going to inherit one from each parent. So we're going to have one of these from each of our parents. So when it comes down to something like freckles, you could have either inherited, like I said, both of my parents have freckles and I have freckles. So it's possible that I inherited the trait for freckles from both of my parents. So I could be big F for freckles. I could have inherited the trait to one parent for freckles and one parent no freckles. So that would be big F, little f. Or I could have inherited the trait for no freckles from both parents. And for me, I have freckles, so I know that's not the case for me. But these are genotypes. They're letter combinations that are representing different genetic makeups. 2 letters, one from each parent. That's how things reproduce sexually. Remember, combination of genes. The next one on here is your phenotype. All right. And your phenotype, the phenotype here, this is the trait that's actually expressed. So it's physical. It's the expressed trait. It's what we actually see. So it's the appearance. It's what it actually looks like. So for example, if we're looking at the trait for freckles, the possible phenotypes is having freckles or not having freckles. So for me, like I said, maybe I carry the gene for no freckles, but because I have freckles, my phenotype, what's my appearance is, my physical appearance is that I have freckles. So this is having freckles or no freckles. So there's 2 alternatives. Or this could be the phenotype. If the flower is purple, its phenotype is purple. It is what it is. It is what it looks like. It's what it appears. So your phenotypes are going to be the different variety of traits that you inherit, what you have, what you look like. So looking in this little graphic section here, I'm just going to draw a little person. And with my little person, here is my little person. So here's my person. All right, and I'm just going to say my person's phenotype. Maybe my person has dark brown hair. Okay, so maybe their phenotype, they inherited dark brown hair. We'll give them some bangs. All right, and maybe they inherited the trait to have green eyes. Okay, so their phenotype is green eyes. We got to give this person some pupils or they're going to look weird. They still look weird. All right, so here we have our little person. And, you know, like I said, maybe they have freckles. So, you know, we could go in and we could give this person a whole bunch of freckles or something like that. So lots of little freckles on their cheeks and a little nose. All right. So your phenotype is your physical appearance, what you actually look like. So if they asked you what's your phenotype for hair color, you would just state what is your hair color. When we're looking at these genetics traits, we're looking at simple dominant and recessive traits this week. So there are more complex inheritance patterns, but today we're focusing on that idea of a dominant trait and a recessive trait. And this is something that Gregor Mendel observed. He observed that in pea plants, he noticed that peas were either green or yellow. There were either purple flowers or white flowers. The plants were either tall or short. The seeds were either round or wrinkled. So he noticed that there was this one or the other scenarios for phenotype, the physical appearance. So he imagined then there had to be just two possible alleles. So when there's only two alleles and one is dominant over the other one, we call it a dominant trait. And this is the form of the trait that dominates or masks the other form of the trait. And we use an uppercase letter to represent that. So some examples of things that are dominant, like I said, freckles are dominant to no freckles. Having dimples is dominant. So dimples is dominant. In pea plants, purple flowers is dominant. In pea plants, green peas is dominant over yellow. All right. And with this, we use a capital letter. So in the case of freckles, we would just pick a letter like capital F. If we were using dimples, maybe we'd pick the letter D. If we were doing purple flowers, maybe peas. If we're using green peas, maybe we would use G. But we're going to use the same letter for a trait and then differentiate it with a dominant, a capital letter, and a lowercase letter. All right, the next one on here is recessive. So having a recessive trait just means it's the form of the trait that's masked or hidden whenever the dominant trait is present, and we use a lowercase letter for that. So we only see a recessive trait if you inherited two recessive alleles, where we observe the dominant trait if we have, as long as the dominant trait is present. So for example, it is recessive to have no freckles. Okay, it is recessive to have no dimples. It is recessive for the flowers to be white in pea plants, so white petals in pea plants. And in pea plants, it is recessive to have yellow peas. Okay, these are all recessive, and we would use a lowercase letter to represent that, and we could use whatever letter we wanted to. And pretty much here, it's not having something like no, and white flowers mean there's no pigment. Yellow peas means there's no green pigment. All right. Other terms that we use here are we use the terms homozygous dominant and homozygous recessive. So homozygous, if we look at the root of that word, homo means that they are the same and they are carrying the same dominant trait. So if you are homozygous for freckles, it means you inherited both the same dominant alleles. So you inherited a big F from mom and a big F from dad. This would mean that you have freckles. So the same uppercase, both dominant traits. Okay, so freckles from both parents. If you have this, guess what? You're gonna have freckles. So I'm just gonna say example. You're going to have freckles for your phenotype, your physical appearance. Homozygous recessive means that you are homozygous So you're homozygous, you have both of the recessive traits. So instead of having inherited both the dominant, you inherited both the recessive. So if I inherit both genes for no freckles, I'm going to have no freckles. All right, so I inherited both recessive alleles, and that's represented with the same lowercase letters. The last one on here is you could inherit the combination to be heterozygous. Now, if I inherit the combination to be heterozygous, hetero means different. So I inherited two different forms of the trait. I inherited one of the dominant and one of the recessive. So we represent that with the dominant. You inherited from one parent the dominant trait and one parent the lowercase, the recessive. And we always put the uppercase letter first. It's kind of like capitalizing the first letter of your name. And in this case, the phenotype here, because the dominant trait is present, you would have freckles. So even though you have the recessive trait, freckles would still be present. All right, so this is your quick over of basic genetic terms. Today you just want to practice using that vocabulary, and the way you're going to practice that vocabulary is with your Star Wars genetics. So the Star Wars genetics is going to go on page 70. So this is on 71. So this is your left and your right side. This is your genetic spread. And you're just going to do some practice questions and upload your practice questions into the Dropbox. So this is going to go in your interactive notebook on page 70. And I'm just going to do the first one with you guys so that you're confident in what you're doing. And we're using some examples from Star Wars. You don't have to be a Star Wars fan to understand it. You just have to seek out the information. So this one says, among Wookiees, and here's Chewbacca, he's a Wookiee. It says there's two possible hair colors. Some Wookiees have brown hair and some have white hair. It says Chewbacca is a Wookiee and he has shaggy brown hair. It says he has one gene for brown hair and one gene for white hair. So it says what trait is being discussed here, and a trait is a specific characteristic. For Chewbacca, we're talking about, we said his hair could be brown or white. He has shaggy brown hair. This is all about hair color. Okay, so what is the hair color? That's the trait. What are the alleles? The alleles are the alternative forms of the trait. So what are the possible hair colors in the Wookiee population? Well, it says here that your hair, if you are a Wookiee, it could be brown or it could be white. So brown or white hair. It says, is Chewbacca homozygous, meaning he has two of the same alleles for hair color, or is he heterozygous? Does he have the two different? Well, if I look at that last sentence, it says he has one gene for brown hair and one gene for white hair. So if he has one for brown and one for white, then he's carrying two different alleles for the trait. So I know that he is heterozygous. And how do I know? He's carrying one of each. So one for brown fur and one for white. What is his genotype? That would be his genetic combination. That's a letter combination. I need to pick a letter for hair color. And because we're talking brown and white hair, because we're talking hair, maybe I'll use H's. So I know that he's heterozygous, so he's going to have the capital letter and the lowercase letter. His phenotype is his physical appearance. That is brown hair. That's what he looks like. So he has brown fur. Which allele is dominant? Well, if Chewbacca carries one of each and his hair is brown, then the one that is dominant must be brown. It has to be brown hair, and I know this because this is what I'm observing. So this is observed, and it's his physical appearance, and he's heterozygous. If a Wookiee carried two genes for the recessive trait, what would they look like? They would have white hair. And what would this genotype be? If you had white hair, you'd have to carry two recessive alleles. And recessive means that you're going to be carrying the two lowercase letters. So if we chose H's, he would have to be little h, little h. All right. So what you guys want to do is you want to try the rest of these on your own. So go solo, kind of like Han Solo, I guess would be appropriate. But you guys want to practice on your own, upload it. I will be available for you guys live this week. Let me know if you have any questions.